Okay, let's talk about the first Red Scare following World War One. Following World War One, the people of the United States faced many issues. During this time, we start to see a growing belief that immigrants were genetically inferior to native born white citizens. Prejudice and hate grows and targets immigrants from Europe and Asia, European and American Jews, Catholics, and African Americans. Many native born citizens and the US government feared that immigrants were radicals and could lead to the demise of democracy. Although our nation is made up of immigrants and all native born citizens have ancestors who migrated to the US at some point in time, the anti sentiment towards immigrants grew. Immigration was so large in the US because many immigrants were escaping religious persecution, famine, and a bad financial situation. America was looked as a promised land to find work in the cities. The United States is made up of a nation of immigrants. Our ancestors come from different countries. In the United States, during and after World War One, we start to see a trend of negativity towards immigrants. A lot of this stems from the shortage of jobs, and it also stems from what we talked about during industrialization. Many immigrants would work for less, which caused business owners to hire them and fire the American born worker who wouldn't work for that low of wages. During and post World War One, we see more and more anti immigrant sentiment. Native born people believed that immigrants were inferior to them. They thought white native born Americans were superior to different races, religions, and nationalities. They also feared that immigrants who were part of labor unions were anarchist and believed in no government. They feared that labor unions would lead to communism. So after World War One, we see this hate and prejudice towards immigrants from many native born Americans, and they want the government to take action. They want immigration to slow down. You do not need to know the specifics of every immigration act, and it is also important to point out that these aren't the first immigration acts in the United States. In 1882, with the Chinese Exclusion Act, they stopped all Chinese immigration. The Gentlemen's Agreement in 1908 denied Japanese laborers to come work in America and recognized that the U.S. had the right to deny Japanese passports, not allowing them to enter the country. The new legislation, or quotas, that came during and post World War I really limited the amount of immigrants allowed to immigrate to the U.S. Starting in 1917 through 1924, we see more intense restriction on immigrants. By 1924, the Immigration Act only allowed 150,000 immigrants per year, 2% of the US population. Communism is the exact opposite of the United States capitalism system. In a communist country, the government has more power and they control property and business. In an ideal communist society, all of the citizens make the same income and they do not own property. This is the opposite of the United States, where we have capitalism, where we believe in private ownership and competition. During World War One, Russia was dealing with problems at home. A civil war erupted. A communist party took control of Russia, led by Vladimir Lenin, who became the dictator of the newly named country, the Soviet Union. This sparked a fear in the US. They were afraid that the same thing would happen here. They were afraid that communism would be spread to the United States. There was a huge fear of communism in the United States. The Red Scare is named after the period of time following World War One, when there was an intense fear of communism in the US. This isn't the only time we see a Red Scare. After World War II, we experienced the same thing. We experienced the fear of communism. The Red Scare was caused by all the social unrest happening in the US and the civil war that took place in Russia. The social unrest includes rioting, protests, bombings, killings, and strikes. Many feared that labor unions would overthrow capitalism and lead us to communism. Americans were especially fearful of immigrants. They thought they were anarchists who wanted no form of government. There was a fear of Russian immigrants who were thought to be spies for their new communist country. The years of 1919 to 1920, there was a lot of social unrest with both the Red Scare and the Red Summer. The Red Scare is a period of time with that intense fear, and we thought that our lives were being challenged. Because of this intense fear, we see a lot of social unrest, whether it's rioting, protesting, and violence from immigrants and native born citizens, or warrantless searches from the police because a next door neighbor was gossiping and told a friend that they were a radical immigrant. The violence and fear of communism is very real during this time, but so is the prejudice and stereotypes that were given to immigrants. Many were accused of being radicals or communists or anarchists because they were immigrants and because they had an accent. In January of 1919, a series of bombings took place, attacking high level officials in the government. One of those bombs exploded outside the doorsteps of Attorney General Mitchell Palmer's house. An angry Attorney General and the American public, Palmer set out to arrest anyone who he suspected to be an anarchist or communist. Palmer raided suspected establishments and houses of immigrants who he believed fit the bill. Oftentimes, people were arrested or were accused because they had an accent. During his raids, he arrested over 6,000 people, forcing many to make false accusations. Although most were released, 600 immigrants still got deported out of the country. Many government officials thought Palmer was going too far and he was using prejudice and stereotypes to make his arrest. Sacco and Vanzetti were a pair of Italian immigrants who were accused, arrested, and convicted of murder and robbery. The two did have anarchist views, but the case was still very weak against them. They lost, and they were sentenced to death. In 1925, another man confessed to committing the crime, but the Supreme Court refused to overturn the verdict, and the two Italians were executed in 1927. This caused a lot of outrage amongst the immigrants community. During this time of unrest, the government, in order to stop the spread of communism, made mass arrests, conducted warrantless searches on houses and businesses, and repressed free speech and deported immigrants. Although they believed they were fighting to stop the spread of communists, many argue that they went too far and interfered with citizens' basic rights. Many argued that this time of fear was warranted but was made more intense by prejudice and stereotypes towards immigration and immigrants.